Speaking Sustainability by Chris Fillie. What is sustainability? What is all the buzz about this term? What does it mean? Why is it relevant to us? Why is it playing an increasing role in business decisions, emerging markets, regulation, and culture? Why has this movement endured beyond fad and is being increasingly cited by industry leaders as a sea change poised to radically alter the global business environment? To begin understanding just what is happening and why, we first need to see where the ideas and information behind the concept of sustainability arose. Though today the use of the term has become so common it may seem like another one of those business consulting buzzwords, the historical roots of the concept emanate from some of the most radical anti-business ideas of the environmental movement and the assertions of the academics, activists, thinkers, and counterculture associated with its early proponents. In the eyes of early environmentalists, business was the problem. How could it ever be the solution? It was the activities of business and industry that were uprooting the land, polluting the air and water, destroying natural treasures, exploiting the poor and voiceless both here and afar, all while vocally fighting against laws and regulations aimed at limiting such activities. Yet here we are today, talking about sustainability, an environmentalist term concerning people and planet, right alongside profit. If you asked the captains of industry a generation ago if this would ever have happened, most would have said a flat-out no. Yet today, the concept of sustainability has managed to infiltrate the business world so thoroughly we hear its name called before many of our most hallowed terms: sustainable development, sustainable investment, sustainable business, sustainable profit. And this is how we will examine this concept. Rather than mere lip service to a fad or a triumph of anti-business theory, sustainability has come to represent a great opportunity to renew focus on value in the business world. And value, specifically the enhancement and recognition of formerly undervalued assets, is exactly what joins this once threatening concept with some of the most advanced entrepreneurial thinking in the business world today. What really happened here? It's really quite simple. For years, environmentalists missed the fact that business is simply an organized form of human activity and can be directed to do whatever ends human beings desire. At the same time, business leaders were missing the fact that much of what environmentalists had to say was based on a broader scope of research and scientific information, more real data than they themselves had access to or could even understand, and they were given this research away for free. Rather than seeing the opportunities for collaboration and problem-solving in the issues at hand, the two camps entrenched and fought, a battle that is only recently showing signs of cooling off. To understand the context of sustainability in the business world, we will start by examining a brief history of the environmental movement as a reactionary response to poorly executed business activity and the undervaluation of huge amounts of natural and social capital. The environmental movement. It is not until nearly the turn of the last century that we see the first big pushes towards environmental preservation through the creation of reserves and parks like Yellowstone and Yosemite. These early environmental causes were influenced by the writings of authors like Henry David Thoreau and the activism of ardent naturalists like John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club. Dismayed at the imminent loss of the last great expanses of U.S. old-growth wilderness to logging and development, Muir was able to influence the 1917 creation of the National Park System, as well as restrictions on clear-cutting and regulations on land development on national lands. But it wasn't until the 1960s that the modern environmental movement first emerged into mainstream culture, beyond a call to merely save wilderness areas and nature, but to save human life itself. And this is where things got ugly. Data was starting to come out that said to business and industry, stop, something is seriously wrong here. Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring, detailed the effects of DDT on compromising our food chain, and Paul Ehrlich's 1968 population bomb foretold of catastrophic sociological and ecological collapse due to accelerating population growth and resource use. This is where the term environmental crisis was coined. Not only were people concerned about losing the places they loved to visit and fish and hike, they began to worry about the health and safety of their children in their own backyards, in their own cities and towns. By the late 1960s, there was growing media attention on industrial disasters such as Cleveland's 1969 Cuyahoga River fire, when a splash of molten steel fell from a rail car onto a slick of industrial waste below, then commonly discharged by the steel industry, on the river below and actually caught the river on fire. Though this was not the first time Cleveland's notorious Cuyahoga burned, the images of the four-story blaze spread throughout the U.S. and across the globe and became an instant media sensation. Water so thoroughly polluted it caught fire. Earlier that year, Santa Barbara, California experienced an oil spill which soiled miles of California's storied beaches, coating birds and seals with thick black tar. Again, this was not the nation's first oil spill. However, the dramatic images of dead seals and birds were displayed across the U.S. and world televisions and newspapers. Political pressure mounted, and this pressure soon pushed open the legislative doors towards the creation of the U.S. EPA in 1970 and the enactment of the Clean Water Act in 1972 by then-President Richard M. Nixon, as well as the adoption of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, in 1970. NEPA was effectively the U.S. government's first policy directive on sustainability. It formally established as a national goal the creation and maintenance of conditions under which, quote, man and nature can exist in productive harmony and fulfill the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations of Americans. Also in 1970, we had the first Earth Day. In 1972, the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment was held in Stockholm, the first time representatives of governments across the globe united in discussions relating to the state of the global environment and its sustainability. The oil crisis of 1973, also known as the Arab oil embargo, when Arab countries cut oil supply to Western nations, quote, in response to the U.S. decision to resupply the Israeli military, end quote, gas prices dramatically increased, while lines and shortages and rationing of gasoline ensued. The West began to wake up to its increasing dependence and thus vulnerability to global fossil fuel supply. This was then followed by the energy crisis of 1979, where a mere 4% reduction in oil supply caused a massive energy panic, lines at gas stations, and shortages again. In its time, this drove home the issues of limited energy supply and fossil fuel dependence, and seeded the first alternative energy and energy savings industries in the U.S. In the 1980s, with the backdrop of the passing of unprecedented environmental legislation and resultant regulations, we begin to see the term sustainability being used by both the government and business communities. It started primarily in the context of the spread of markets into the developing world, where many factors such as a lack of environmental and labor regulations, coupled with political corruption and crime, allowed a level of exploitation and destruction of poor and indigenous communities and natural resources and ecosystems since unheard of in modern times. What was once considered economic development was now being looked at with scrutiny for possible negative social and environmental consequences. Here the term sustainable development first comes into vogue. Though the roots of the concept can be found as far back as the 1968 UNESCO Biosphere Conference, the term sustainable development is commonly described as being first used in a 1981 White House Council on Environmental Quality report. Quote, the key concept here is sustainable development. If economic development is to be successful over the long term, it must proceed in a way that protects the natural resource base of developing countries. Where before, we could simply point to a rise in GDP and say, look, we improved the country, we were now faced with the question of the cost of that improvement to the collective environment and human population. Soon further questions were being asked, such as, did everyone's position improve, or only a small group of favored trade partners? Were people's property rights and civil rights protected? How just was the distribution of profits to the community they were extracted from? How much of the existing assets were left in place to provide income for future generations? Today, the term sustainable development has further broadened from its early focus on what was then termed the Third World, and then generally limited to activities of extractive industries and large-scale agriculture and manufacturing, today to encompass all forms of business development, from emerging markets to the reinvention of existing ones, from developing countries to the most developed. In today's term, the verb for the concept of sustainability as a whole has become sustainable development, and the two are used in this context interchangeably, i.e., sustainable development is the act of implementing sustainability. This term in the business world has become synonymous with the idea of the triple bottom line, first coined in 1994 by John Elkington, whom Businessweek deemed the Dean of Corporate Social Responsibility. This is also referred to as the three-legged stool in government and policy writings. At its core, this requires a reconciliation of environmental, social, and economic demands, the three legs of sustainability, all of which must be considered in the decision-making process. Essentially, what we have here is an expansion of value consideration, an expansion of scope, an expansion of details we must pay attention to. We will discuss the tools and strategies to achieve this later in this course. But considering these elements demands a more rigorous and comprehensive look into our business models, our sourcing, our disposal, our activities up and down the supply chain, the buildings we inhabit and the energy we use, even our organizational culture. Economists call this process the internalization of externalities. Sociologists call this expanding social responsibility. Environmentalists call this going green. So what happened here? Why are we in the business world suddenly being asked to look at all of our actions on such a global scale, across such a wide spectrum of concern? Why are we suddenly being asked to pay so much attention to detail? Why isn't the old way of doing business working, steamrolling ahead with our eye on the bottom line of profit alone? Why are businesses going even further today, not only paying attention to their externalities, but going so far as to internalize them, plugging them back into their business models and production? Why are corporations expanding social responsibility? Why are more and more businesses going green? The short answer is, the earth got small. And with increases in global population, economic growth in developing countries, and information technology, the earth is getting smaller each day. This is a photograph taken from Apollo 17. This picture was the first clear image of an illuminated face of Earth from space, the entire planet. For the first time in history, humans had traveled far enough away from our home to turn around and snap a picture of it. Astronauts thought it looked like, quote, a blue marble. This image, now considered the most widely circulated image in history, drove home the idea of Spaceship Earth and the idea that it is a small world after all. From this view, our world is not the vast, endless wilderness our forefathers experienced when they first geared up the machines of industry and development. From space, Earth is but a tiny blue sphere, floating in a vast sea of blackness, of which all life we know depends. Today, not only are our most well-trained elite astronauts going to experience this firsthand, Sir Richard Branson, CEO of the Virgin conglomerates, will be giving civilians the opportunity to glimpse the Earth from space, the same view that awestruck the first astronauts through the first commercial spaceflight business, Virgin Galactic. The company itself touts the experience as one that will change the life perspective of its passengers, as the Apollo flight changed the perspective of the world. Seeing it from out there, surrounded by the incredibly thin protective layer of atmosphere, helps to waken one to the fragility of the small portion of the planet's mass that we inhabit and the importance of protecting it. Bringing this experience to a far wider constituent will, we believe, extend and encourage this perception. So the story of sustainability begins not only with these changes in human perception, but with the advances in technology and resource use that allowed us to get there, to turn around and snap that shot of our planet suspended in space. So let's back up a bit and see just how far we have come. Life on Earth began some 3.8 billion years ago. 3 billion years ago, life began harnessing the energy of the sun and carbon bonds through the process of photosynthesis. For the last 650 million years, a small fraction of these life forms were trapped and slowly sunk and compressed in the sediment, deeper and deeper into the Earth's crust, storing carbon in energy-dense molecules. Terrestrial organisms produce solid carbon deposits like coal, and gaseous ones such as methane, ethane, and propane. the main chemical components in natural gas. Oceanic organisms generally formed oil as well as natural gas. This energy accumulation took on the order of hundreds of millions of years. And when human beings first discovered its power and how to use it, what has been dubbed the Industrial Revolution occurred. The Industrial Revolution. This introduction of concentrated energy instituted a sea change in business practice. Machines were invented to use the fuels to provide the power that once humans and animals provided. Transportation times were slashed with the spread of the steam engine railroads, motor power boats and barges, and the automobile and tractor trailer. With new energy to drive massive increases in worker output and productivity, we soon saw unprecedented booms in sustained economic growth. And with increases in resources and technology like medicine and sanitation, booms in population were not far off. In the 2 centuries following 1800, the world's average income increased over tenfold, while the world's population increased over sixfold. As our populations and living standards rose, we developed technologies to use these fuels to make fertilizers and pesticides, to make planting and harvesting machines, to mechanize processing and shipping around the globe, increasing food production. In what was labeled Green Revolution agriculture, we essentially developed a way to turn fossil fuels into food. Today, some of our food contains as much as 90% of their embodied energy from fossil fuels, with only 10% coming from the natural environment itself. As our populations and wealth grew, so did our communication technology. Where it once took weeks to months to send news across the oceans, today we can communicate instantly and transfer massive amounts of data in fractions of seconds. The information age was born. This globalization of communication networks even further allowed the globalization of markets. Now we could have our materials sourced in Africa, our manufacturing in China, our assembly in Mexico, our customer service in India, our supply chain management in Ireland, our executive offices in New York, and our shipping headquarters in Atlanta. With instant communication and cheap fuel, there were no limits to how global we could become. All told, fossil fuels and the technology it spurred drove a 70-fold increase in total global wealth from 1800 through today. We expanded and grew across the globe because of energy returns on investment of staggering proportions, when coal deposits were found at the surface and oil was literally gushing from the ground. When we first tapped fossil fuels, it took as little as 1 unit worth of energy to extract 100 units. Today, our best producing oil fields, such as those in Saudi Arabia, are yielding 10 units for every 1 unit invested. Now, this is still a 1,000% return, quite handsome indeed, but a far cry from the 10,000% available to our forebears. Today, the average U.S. field is yielding from 3 to 6 barrels per barrel invested. We are having to go deeper, further, and to more dangerous and costly extremes to tap new reserves. This diminishing return on energy investment was seldom pondered outside of academia and the closed doors of industrial strategy before the energy crisis of the 1970s. These ideas were first publicly declared and made popular by M. King Hubbert, a geologist and mathematician who worked for Shell Oil Company. In 1956, Hubbert presented a paper to the American Petroleum Association that stated that for any given geographical area, from an individual oil field to the planet as a whole, the rate of petroleum production of the reserve over time would resemble a bell curve. His description of the diminishing returns of oil fields and ultimately global oil supply became known as Hubbert's curve. The top of the curve is called Hubbert's peak. This is one of the most often misrepresented ideas in the energy field by both proponents and opponents of perpetual growth. Hubbert's peak has nothing to do with running out of oil, or coal or natural gas, or any other resource for that matter. That is simply not going to happen. It would be energetically and economically impossible to squeeze the last drop of oil and gas out of the dirt, rock, and mud of Earth. What it means is running out of cheap energy that yields more energy than it takes to physically harvest. Hubbert's peak represents the inevitable decline in the rate of extraction of a given resource over time. He predicted correctly the peak of U.S. oil production to be near 1970, back in 1956. He predicted the peak of global oil production to be near 2005. And in 1975, he stated that it may happen later due to any further political restrictions on supply, as experienced in the oil embargoes, or economic ones on demand, such as the global recession of 2008. It will take a few more years of data to see if he was right. Since the greatest economic and population booms of the past can be traced to fossil fuels, we can see that their limited availability is not just an energy issue, but one of economics and social organization as well. So, while our reach and impact has gone global, the very energy supply that has allowed this globalization has hit its peak, and thus, so has everything upon which it relies. Journalist and educator Richard Heinberg describes this phenomenon as peak everything. We have peak oil, peak in the U.S. in 1970, global is somewhere around right now. Energy return on investments from the peak in 1970 are about 12 to 1 in the U.S. They're less than 6 to 1 today. We have peak ecological stability, ecological crisis, and the issues of climate change. We have peak materials. We have water shortages, soil and nutrient shortages, and metal shortages. And peak population, which represents a social crisis. Now, this is the view of science and industry, not the radical margins. But if you read the business section of the newspaper or talk with modern economists, we still hear the mantra grow, 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 as if there were no limits to our high-yield energy and resources, or that those limits are so far off in the future we might as well ignore them. This is simply a holdover from our pre-peak assumptions. And though the fallacy has become largely codified in mainstream economics, in the light of the details examined through the shift towards sustainability, we see that a movement towards a steady state economics is afoot.